Trump let that summit come and go. No ceasefire, no secondary sanctions. Lindsey Graham hasn't pushed the bill forward, and here we are. And what I can say is that Putin will sacrifice everything in his country before he gives up on this war. And so he has no incentive at this stage of the game to give up on the war.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Sir Bill Browder as we get all into this Russia economy and, of course, Trump and Putin trying to get a deal over the line or a lack thereof. Just a reminder that you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube, or you can stream us as a podcast, wherever you get your podcast. Bill, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
Let's start off with, well, before we get into the relationship and what's going on between Trump and Putin, I want to start off with what's happening in the Russia economy. This article from the Moscow Times, it's really been making the rounds the last few days. It details how Russia's economy has slipped into technical stagnation in the second quarter of this year. Sberbank CEO German Gref, he repeated concerns that Russia is tipping into a recession and that the central bank needs to cut interest rates even further. Now, of course, you spent many years in Russia learning the economy, learning the ways of the world there. So can you explain really what this means in layman's terms?
Well, first and foremost, I should explain that whenever a Russian government official talks about official Russian government statistics, they're made up. So if they're talking about slipping into recession, what that most likely means is that they're in a deep recession, slipping into a depression. And if you look at it very objectively, so what's going on in Russia is they started this war. As a result of starting this war, a lot of the major customers of their economy stopped buying their products. And their products are principally oil and gas, various types of metals. And so you saw the entire European continent stop buying Russian gas. The Germans, who were totally dependent on it, started buying gas from Qatar and places like that. Oil is now down. The Ukrainians are destroying their oil refineries, so they can't sell their refined oil products, and so on and so forth. And so the economy is not in great shape to start out with. So what did the government do to try to save the economy? They started investing a huge amount of money from their savings to build military factories and put people to work there and to create economic activity there. And to a certain extent, that has softened the blow. But you know, the situation in Russia is extremely grave. And every once in a while, there's like a little truth coming out. And there was a statement made by the CEO of one of the largest steel companies in Russia. It's called Severstal. And he compared what's going on in the Russian economy right now to the late 1990s. And probably not as many people listening to this show will know what happened in the late 1990s, but I was there at the time, and Russia went into probably the most cataclysmic economic crisis it's ever had in 1998, and that's what he's comparing it to right now. And so there's a real problem there, and Putin can put on a brave face and he can try to pretend that it's not real, but they've got a real economic problem. It's only getting worse.
So Gref said that if the interest rates aren't cut to 14% by the end of the year, that's still not even enough for the economy to recover. So right now we've got Putin overspending money on the war. He's borrowing money, and then of course, as you mentioned, there's pressure on the oil and gas revenue. So do you see Putin, if the economy stays at this pace, continue to funnel this much money into his war?
Well, it all depends on how he decides to divvy up the money that he's got coming in. So Russia continues to sell oil. They sell oil mostly to the Chinese and Indians and Turks, and they continue to buy it and they continue to get money from that. And then the question is, what does Putin, what's important to him? Is, he can cut off completely social welfare. He can cut off all sorts of spending on medical, on education, on all that kind of stuff in order to pay for the army. And so, I mean, he can carry on for a long time because he's living in a world where he decides and nobody else has any say in the matter. There's no public opinion that matters. It's not like he's got to be elected in 4 years or in 2 years or anything like that. He's completely in control of the country. As long as people are scared of him and he runs a totalitarian police state, which is what he does, he can pretty much do whatever he wants. And remember, like, North Korea is a terrible economy. The people are literally starving to death, but Kim Jong-un has got a very powerful army, and Putin can and probably will do the same thing. So I wouldn't make any predictions about, Russia not being able to afford their war based on this tipping into depression or recession or whatever they're describing it as. But to the extent that we in the West decide that we want to put even more pressure on Russia, that could do the trick. And what specifically I mean by that is, if we were to punish people who buy Russian oil to the extent that it's painful for them, so they stop buying Russian oil, then it's game over for Putin.
Well, on that note, Bill, we've placed some sanctions. Of course, the US has placed tariffs on India, and a lot of European countries, as you've mentioned, have stopped buying Russian oil and gas and moved over to Qatar and some other Arab states. But if this is the case, and we've seen Russia's economy continue to dip, if analysts would predict even further by the end of the year, and then of course we've seen the price of gasoline surge 50% since January. And as you mentioned, a lot of this is to do with the fact that the Ukrainian army has been targeting oil refineries in Russia. So if that's the case, and it's looking semi-grim for Vladimir Putin in terms of keeping his economy afloat, how should the US and the West be taking advantage of this?
Even without all this stuff, we should be trying to put more pressure on Russia, even if there wasn't all this trouble. I think that President Trump, he laid out a pretty good plan. He said, and this was prior to the summit in Anchorage, Alaska, he said that if Russia doesn't agree to a ceasefire, then he would impose secondary sanctions on China, India, and all other countries buying Russian gas. And to the extent that he didn't say that, there's a piece of legislation hanging out there from Senator Lindsey Graham, one of Trump's big allies, along with Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat, with 85 co-sponsors out of 100, which would impose 500% tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. And so if that were to have been implemented in response to Putin refusing to cease fire, we would be in great shape right now. Putin would be in bad shape, we would be in good shape, and he would at some point, either now or pretty soon from now, be forced to negotiate. But he hasn't been. Trump let that summit come and go. No ceasefire, no secondary sanctions. Lindsey Graham hasn't pushed the bill forward, and here we are. And what I can say is that Putin will sacrifice everything in his country before he gives up on this war. And so he has no incentive at this stage of the game to give up on the war.
Before we get into what Trump's been saying in the last few days about where he's at with Putin, where he's at with getting this meeting between Putin and Zelensky happening, I want to ask you, Bill, do you think that Vladimir Putin is going to be relying a lot more heavily as the days go on forcing state companies to be contributing to his war? Now, I have found that this has really slipped through the cracks in terms of how he operates his economy, but this is something that you're obviously very familiar with. He does it through means such as forcing companies to pay special taxes and forcing them to purchase certain bonds. So is this something that he will continue to do in order to keep his economy going and in order to keep funding his war?
Absolutely, definitely. I mean, he'll do everything. And so, I mean, just in very simple terms, Russia has been cut off from the international financial markets, and so they can no longer borrow money from the West, which is what they used to do. And so what do? Well, as you mentioned, Putin is forcing all companies to buy effectively what they call war bonds or war deposits, which would mean that all the money in the economy is getting sucked into the government to pay for military expenditures. And he will do that and continue to do that. And, there's no such thing as private property in Russia. There's no such thing as independent wealth. Everything effectively belongs to Putin. I mean, a lot of it definitely belongs to Putin literally belongs to Putin, but whatever doesn't belong to Putin, he can call on if he wants to, and he has, and he will continue to do that. And so we should not underestimate the willingness that he has to do whatever he has to do to keep this war going, because this war is what keeps him in power. And if he wasn't in power, he'd be strung up on a lamppost. He would be killed. That's what happens in a place like Russia. So this is a war for survival of Vladimir Putin.
Here's what Donald Trump said to CBS this week, Bill. He said, in terms of his peace-pursuing efforts, he said, I've been watching it, I've been seeing it, and I've been talking about it with President Putin and President Zelensky. Something is going to happen, but they are not ready yet. And that something is going to happen. We are going to get it done. So when he says something is going to happen, Bill, it's been 3 weeks since this Alaska summit, as you mentioned. We haven't heard any sort of commitment from Vladimir Putin in anything. We've heard the opposite, where he's talked about how he wants to continue his war efforts. So I guess your reaction to the fact that this does feel very stalled.
Well, of course it's stalled. So so you've got this situation. Vladimir Putin decided in February 2022 to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was his decision to do that. The Ukrainians had no say in the matter. They didn't do anything to provoke it. It was an unprovoked war of aggression. At any point, Putin can decide to withdraw, to stop. The Ukrainians, the only thing they're doing is trying to prevent themselves from being occupied by Russia. And by the way, when they get occupied, the most terrible, horrific things happen to the people there. The children get kidnapped, the women are raped, the men are tortured and often killed. And we've seen that in occupied parts of Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are all they want to do is just have their own country, have peace, not be raped. That's what the Ukrainians want. And so at any point, if Putin wanted to, he could stop this war. The war is completely within his destiny. It's his decision and his decision alone. And he's decided that he doesn't want to stop the war. He wants to full on take over Ukraine. And so the only way to end this war is to put pressure on him. And so what's been happening up until now is President Trump has been putting pressure on Ukraine to capitulate. And that doesn't do anything. All that does is create a humanitarian crisis if that were to happen. And Ukraine's not going to agree to that, because why would they? They would rather be at war than basically commit suicide by allowing Russia to occupy them. And so Putin's not going to stop unless he's under pressure, unless he's forced to stop. And he hasn't been put under pressure. In fact, just the opposite. He's been given a lifeline as a result of the Anchorage summit with President Trump.
Absolutely. And I want to keep going on that point, Bill, because the Anchorage summit came about because Donald Trump had issued this 10 to 12 day deadline on Vladimir Putin to end the war or risk these sanctions, as you mentioned, these 100% sanctions on and tariffs on countries importing Russian oil. Putin decided to play ball, so he said yes to a meeting, which is, of course, the Alaska summit that was 3 weeks ago. Trump went in there saying that he would get a ceasefire. There was no mention of the ceasefire. The only sort of reprieve or, I guess, development that we thought would happen was a meeting between Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky that Trump would arrange. Now, it's been 3 weeks, and Trump had come out of that meeting saying that he was beginning arrangements already. But then a Kremlin aide said just a few days ago, right now there is a talk of a trilateral meeting, of a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, but specifically, as far as I know, there was no agreement between Putin and Trump on this. So the Kremlin have come out, and Bill has said the absolute opposite to Trump. They've said that there was never an agreement, that they clearly have no plans to meet with President Zelensky. And what that means is that this 10 to 12 day deadline was for nothing, and that these sanctions are still up in the air. We have no idea, and all we know is that Trump's threats have gone on deaf ears, and he's also ignoring them himself.
Well, they're not threats if he doesn't follow through on them, and he's made 6 ultimatums to Vladimir Putin to end this war, and Vladimir Putin has ignored all 6 ultimatums, and there's been no consequence for ignoring those ultimatums. And so, you know, this is if there ever was a definition of Trump always chickening out, it seems to be chickening out with Vladimir Putin. He doesn't seem to have any desire to hold Putin to account. He doesn't view Putin in the same way as most Americans do, as being an evil man who needs to be contained. And so Putin is taking advantage of the situation, and he's hoping that if he just continues to bombard Ukraine civilians, and I mean, there's no military purpose for bombing civilians in Kiev and other cities in Ukraine. There's absolutely nothing, there's no purpose to that other than to terrorize the Ukrainians. And he will continue to do that because there's nobody telling him to stop, and there's no consequence for him to do that. And so it's the Ukrainians pretty much on their own with some financial help from the Europeans and the UK and Canada are going to have to just keep on defending themselves until a point in time when they've got some military advantage or something breaks inside Russia.
Yesterday, Donald Trump had a phone call with several European leaders and he pressured the countries who are still buying Russian oil, which is Hungary and Slovakia, to stop. Do you see them listening to Trump when those two countries are incredibly reliant on Russian oil?
Well, whatever Trump asks them to do is sort of secondary. The Ukrainians took the matters into their own hands and bombed the pipeline so that the oil stopped. And so that's one way to get them to stop buying Russian oil.
I mean, it has resumed since, Bill, but you would only use that as motivation from the Ukrainian army to continue bombing that pipeline. But one of the other things that came out of this meeting was Trump basically urging European leaders to place economic pressure on China for funding Russia's war effort, which of course buying a lot of Russian oil. But the United States hasn't placed sanctions or tariffs on China. They've despite doing so to India. So wouldn't you agree that this is a little bit critical for Trump to be telling European leaders to continue placing economic pressure on China when the United States hasn't done so?
The whole thing is just absolute chaos. It doesn't make nothing makes any sense. It's all hypocritical. It doesn't, if Trump wanted to end this war, he has the power to end this war. He's just all over the place. There's no logic, rhyme, reason to what he's doing, and the only thing that one can assume is that he doesn't really want to end this war. It's not really, he might have some, it might be one of his bullet points on his Nobel Peace Prize application. But if he really wanted to end this war, he has the capacity to do this. He's not using the power that he has, and that's the bottom line. It doesn't matter what he says to whom.
The only thing we did get out of yesterday was the 26 countries pledging post-war security guarantees to Ukraine, including the deployment of international force on land, sea and air. Of course, see the United States also agreed to help, but of course no boots on the ground. So is this at least significant, Bill, for post-war efforts?
Well, there's not going to be a post-war until the war ends. And so everyone can talk all they want about putting boots on the ground and all that kind of stuff. But right now, Putin has not altered his maximalist objectives by 1 inch, and until he does, this is all just sort of fantasy football to talk about, coalition of the willing, boots on the ground, etc. Right now, we need to figure out how do we get Putin out of Ukraine, and he's not getting out of Ukraine. He's not stopping. He continues to do what he's doing. He's not making any progress, but he continues to do what he's doing, and everybody in Europe understands that. This is not about Ukraine. This is about Putin trying to stay in power, and he's going to start a war with the Baltics or with Poland or with God knows who, and then the Europeans will get dragged into it, and that's why they've got such a strong interest in pushing back on this.
Putin said this week that Russia is willing to fight to achieve all of its objectives if Ukraine doesn't agree to a deal. You and I have spoken at great lengths. They're obviously never going to agree to this proposal, which would see their sovereignty ripped away from them, would see Russia as quite literally the language being used in Ukraine if they agreed to any of this. But Putin, he made these remarks, Bill, while he was in China visiting Xi Jinping, and of course in the company of North Korea's Kim Jong-un. So do you think when he said these remarks, he was there also requesting help monetarily from these countries? Because we did see Kim Jong-un come out and say that he would help Russia with whatever they needed.
Well, Kim Jong-un, he doesn't have a lot of resources other than more meat for the grinder in terms of soldiers. But Putin he's not doing well. He's got a lot of problems, economic problems. They've lost a huge number of troops. The fact that they've had to rely on North Korean troops and North Korean weapons, which North Korea is one of the least, successful countries in the world. And for Russia to have to draw on that, shows how desperate Putin is. But he is desperate, and he's there, and he's looking for a lifeline wherever he can get it, and he's getting some from North Korea, and he's certainly getting some from China, and he wants to get more money from China. And of course, the Chinese are loving this because they're getting cheap oil and all sorts of other resources from Russia, and on top of that, they're draining the resources of their major competitors, which are the United States and Europe.
What did you make, Bill, of the meeting this week between those three leaders? They've been called the axis of upheaval by many military analysts and many papers this week. Do you think the three of them were meeting together publicly for the first time as a bit of a middle finger to not only Trump, but the West?
Very much so. I mean, these are all isolated countries, or certainly North Korea and Russia are isolated countries. And the fact that China is a dictatorship, a totalitarian state, that represses its people, these are not nice people. It's not like anyone's emigrating to China, North Korea, or Russia. People from those countries are trying to get out. And so here you have these dictatorships, totalitarian dictatorships, all, showing us in the West that, if they get their way, if we don't stand up to them, we're going to be living under their control. And that's something that we have to fight back at every step.
In conjunction to this, Bill, we saw Narendra Modi and Vladimir Putin meet earlier in the week, and we saw them hugging, we saw them holding hands, and this was happening at the same time that India had been hit with 50% tariffs from the United States for buying Russian oil, cheap Russian oil. So did that look to you on the world stage that India, Narendra Modi, didn't really care about Trump?
Well, I mean, Trump has alienated the Indians. The Indians felt themselves to be friendly and in alliance with Trump, and then they got hit with these tariffs, which in this particular case, I believe in the tariffs if they were applied evenly into China and to Turkey and India, and hopefully as a policy tool to stop getting them to buy Russian oil. But there's a lot of countries out there that thought they were friends with America that are finding out that they're not, and they're looking for new friends, and that's what you have going on with India, and the fact that India was even in China. India and Chinese are having border skirmishes and killing each other, and the fact that they're all together tells you how bad the relationship has gotten between India and the United States.
Bill, just a final question. Senator Mitch McConnell this week, he said, what we need to do is to avoid the headline at the end of the war that says Russia wins, America loses. It has a huge worldwide implication. Now, your reaction to that from a Republican senator who's come out and said that?
Well, he's retiring, so he can say whatever he wants, and he's saying the truth, which is that, and I would say that Russia's winning and America's losing right now based on the policies towards Russia. And it could be changed. The one good thing that we can say about this Trump foreign policy towards Russia or foreign policy towards anybody is that it can change on a dime. He can, this is like arbitrary randomness. And so hopefully some of this arbitrary randomness goes towards being tough on Putin going forward.
So Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.